Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Nero, the 5th Emperor of Rome, the Emperor of Roses, also known as the Queen of Umu. By looking into her class, design, skill set, backstory, and characterization, how well does the Nero of the Fate franchise compare to her historical counterpart? And what grade would I give her depiction? Let's get into it. So, if that spoiler warning didn't give it away, this video is a lot. Nero has so many appearances in the Fate franchise that she's right up there with Artoria herself, and that's not even the entire list. Because there is so much for me to talk about, I've decided to split Nero into 2 videos. The first video will discuss the historical Nero, with a primary focus upon her saber version throughout the Fate franchise. The second video will talk about another version of her, the character we know as Draco. Now with that out of the way, let's continue. Nero is a saber class servant, which is weird to say the least, because as far as I can tell, the real Nero didn't so much as set foot on a battlefield in his life, much less actually wield a sword. Aside from being one of Rome's most notorious emperors, Nero is best known for being a performer, acting, music, poetry, chariot races, that sort of thing. Now that last one gives us a hint as to one of the classes Nero might qualify for. Being into acting, music, and poems might also allow her to be a caster. Contemporary opinions of Nero's skill at the arts are varied. Some say he was very talented, others that he was mediocre, and still more say he was absolutely awful. As for the chariot racing, Nero famously took part in the Olympic Games of 67 CE. Yet, despite the fact that his chariot crashed and he left the track midway through, Nero was still declared the winner of the race. Apparently, the judges based their decision on how Nero was doing before the crash, that, had Nero not crashed, then surely he would have won the race. I'm sure it had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that Nero had given the judges some financial incentives in advance. So Nero got the gold for the chariot race despite having crashed, just as he was declared the winner for every other event he took part in, including artistic events that were held for the very first time, where Nero was the only participant, and which have not been held since. Anyway, those times when Nero hosts events like Nero Fest or the Olympics and Fate Grand Carnival, those are good connections since the real Nero actually did participate in the Olympic Games. So based on the history, I could see Nero being either a rider or a caster, but Fate's Nero isn't either of these things. I mean, her summer version is a caster, but there's no Nero rider. Instead, she's a saber, and the reason for this is because Nero made it so through the use of the skill Imperial Privilege. I'll be talking more about that particular skill later, but as far as class goes, Nero being a saber is a blatant fail from an accuracy perspective. Getting into her character design, we first have to talk about gender because Nero has been flipped from her historical counterpart. Despite being one of the older characters in the Fate franchise, the writer's justifications for this swap are thin. At first glance, Nero is just a bait and switch. She looks a lot like Artoria, to the point that they joke about Nero being a palette swap. But digging a little deeper, the only real justification for Nero being flipped is the classic "history recorded my gender wrong" line, your typical low-effort gender swap. With that said, Nero has a better claim to this than most, because Nero is very much a historical loser, someone who historians were very unkind towards, and it is only in recent decades that people have started to reevaluate Nero. So while the whole "history got my gender wrong" bit is pretty lazy, it wouldn't be the first time historians biased against Nero have added to or changed something in his story, like suggesting that he shagged his mother, beat his second wife to death, sexually assaulted a Vestal Virgin, and a whole litany of other crimes. As for her actual design, Nero doesn't look very Roman. The only thing Roman about this outfit is the color red. Between the epaulettes on the shoulders and the gown-like dress, this looks more like something out of the 18th or 19th century, which is way after the fall of both Western and Eastern Rome, much less when Nero actually lived. Since Nero is one of the first characters in Fate Grand Order, her ascension forms don't change much at all. Only the third ascension adds anything of note, that big lion pauldron thing, as well as the lion in her final ascension. As for the lion, there are 2 possible reasons for this. The first is a story where Nero supposedly strangled a lion in the arena while nude. and attempt to perform the same feat as Heracles did during his first labor. Now, this didn't actually happen in real life. It was an idea Nero had for the Olympic Games in 71 CE, but he died before that could happen. In any case, like the other Olympic events Nero participated in, this one was going to be rigged by weakening the lion enough so that Nero could actually pull that off. The other connection between Nero and lions is much more disturbing, and something that actually did happen in real life. The most infamous event of Nero's reign was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which some believe that Nero either started or that he didn't do anything about it. The infamous myth of Nero playing his lyre while the city burns around him. The most credible account of these events, the one by Tacitus, states that Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was in Antium, but he rushed back to help with relief efforts, spending his own money, and letting people stay in his palaces. But since Nero then took the opportunity to rebuild Rome in his own image, including starting the construction of the Domus Aurea upon the ruins, rumors circulated that Nero deliberately started the fire so that he could carry out these grand construction plans. To counter these rumors, Nero blamed the fire on the followers of a small offshoot of Judaism, known as the Christians. In the city of Rome, hundreds were arrested and executed in particularly gruesome ways, such as being burned alive and used as street lamps, crucified, or thrown into the arena to be torn apart by various animals, with lions being the most often mentioned. But since Fate's portrayal of Nero is probably the most sympathetic depiction of Nero ever made, the lion connections probably have to do with that planned stunt of Nero strangling a lion to mimic Heracles, rather than how Christians and other criminals would be thrown to lions in the arena. Even so, the Great Fire of Rome and Nero's subsequent persecution of Christians would have a profound impact upon Nero's reputation, since while Christianity was a pretty minor offshoot of Judaism back then, it got a bit bigger than that later on, and Christians, who have always been fixated upon persecution against them, real or imagined, have never forgotten that Nero was the first person to do it, which has played a major role in why, despite the fact that Roman historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio were almost certainly biased against Nero, later Christians weren't exactly in a hurry to treat Nero more fairly. Anyway, sorry, I got a bit sidetracked. So, Nero, character design. It's not great, looking like something from over a millennia and a half after Nero's death. The only real connections to Nero to be found here is the color red and the lion. With that said, there is another version of Fate's Nero that, believe it or not, actually does have a solid connection to the real Nero. Towards the end of his life, there are two stories where Nero has a, shall we say, unconventional marriage ceremony, certainly by the standards of his time. The first involved a slave boy named Sporus, who apparently greatly resembled Nero's second wife, Poppaea, who had died in 65 CE. Nero decided to marry Sporus in 67 CE, but since Sporus was a boy, Nero tried to fix that by castrating him. They didn't exactly have reassignment surgery back then, and Sporus wasn't in a position to say no either. The other curious marriage Nero had was with a freedman named Pythagoras in 64 CE. Yes, he had the same name as the Greek philosopher and mathematician. Now, unlike Sporus, Pythagoras was not castrated or made to play as the wife. Rather, it was Nero himself who did that, partaking in a wedding ceremony where Nero dressed himself up as the bride to Pythagoras. In other words, the concept of a Nero Bride does, in fact, have a real connection to the historical Nero, albeit one from only one small anecdote from Nero's reign. Moving into her skill set, Nero's first skill is Migraine, which becomes Chalice of Wealth after an upgrade. Migraine is a sort of generic skill possessed by two servants, Nero herself and Elizabeth Bathory. This skill appears to be something of a curse, a weakness that afflicts these two characters that comes from, quote, the birthplace of one's previous life. Honestly, it's really vague. But what isn't vague is that Fate's Nero regularly suffers from headaches, something we have seen multiple times. There's actually a sizable amount of Fate lore surrounding this, that Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was both poisoning and giving the antidote to Nero from an early age, explicitly as a means to control Nero and force her to do Agrippina's bidding. When Nero later killed her mother, the poison was still in Nero, but now she no longer had the antidote, resulting in increasingly debilitating headaches that would plague Nero for the rest of her life, and likely contributed to Nero's increasingly erratic and questionable behavior. But does this have anything to do with the actual Nero? Short answer? Maybe. The stuff about Nero's mother being a manipulative control freak that Nero later turned against is certainly true. But Nero being afflicted with headaches? Finding details about that has proven challenging. Now, Nero was the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and he was distantly descended from Julius Caesar. Caesar rather famously had epilepsy, and his descendants in the Julio-Claudian dynasty all seem to have had various neurological conditions that might have contributed to some of the questionable behaviors attributed to its members, particularly its two most infamous members, Caligula and his nephew Nero. But since this was almost 2,000 years ago, getting precise medical information is hard. But in any case, Nero probably did have some kind of condition that may have given him severe headaches, so this skill could work. Maybe. As for the upgrade name Chalice of Wealth, that seems to be a reference to the Whore of Babylon, but, well, we're saving that for the next video. On another note, I mentioned that Nero is distantly descended from Julius Caesar, and if you remember back from my Caesar video, he in turn claimed descent from Aeneas, who in turn claimed descent from the goddess Venus. In other words, Nero can claim distant descendants from the goddess Venus, which is probably why Venus comes up on a few occasions with her, most notably in her Saber Venus form in Fate Extella. Nero's second skill is Imperial Privilege, which becomes Imperial Privilege Applause after an upgrade. Imperial Privilege is a generic skill that is typically found on emperors, where they are able to assert that, yes, in fact, they can do something, despite the fact that the historical record doesn't support it. Basically, it's a skill where its owner can say, yes, I am a master swordsman, writer, artist, etc., because I say so. Nero is the first servant in Fate to acquire this skill, and so is the benchmark for what it is capable of. It allows Nero to claim skills that the real Nero almost certainly didn't have, such as being a good enough swordsman to qualify for the Saber class. Now, on the one hand, from an accuracy perspective, this skill is basically Fate admitting that Nero wasn't anything even close to being as talented as she is portrayed, that she is demonstrating abilities that she clearly should not have. But on the other hand, remember that bit I mentioned about Nero participating in the Olympics? How he won every event he participated in? That he won the chariot race despite having crashed the chariot partway through? In other words, Nero used his imperial privilege to be declared the winner. That, like her historical counterpart, Fate's Nero is a dirty cheater who claims to have things that she doesn't deserve. So if you think about it, this skill might actually be good from an accuracy perspective, because it is consistent with how the real Nero behaved, proclaiming his talent and skill in things that, in practice, he wasn't actually that good at. Lastly, Nero's third skill is Invictus Spiritus, or Unconquerable Spirit, a gut skill with a bit of extra lore behind it. Apparently 3 days after Nero's suicide, her body was found by a Roman soldier who, feeling that such an end for Nero was a pitiable one, decided to cover her body, only for Nero's eyes to open and give the soldier thanks, despite the fact that she had been dead for 3 days. Now, is this something from history? No, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this skill is a fail, because there actually is a legend involving Nero appearing after his death, the Nero Redivivus legend. This legend is that Nero had not actually died, but had instead fled to the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, where he was much more popular, and that he would someday return to Rome to restore his role and/or take revenge upon his enemies. There were at least 3 people who claimed to be Nero that started uprisings in the 20 years after his death in 68 CE, but they were all quashed. And, of course, Christianity would have its own legend about Nero possibly returning someday, though that one is far more ominous, and one that we will be getting back to another time. Anyway, my point is that while this skill's backstory seems to be an invention of the Fate franchise, the concept of Nero coming back from the dead to return someday is not. Now, as for the skill sets for Nero's many other variations, I ultimately decided to mostly leave them out of this video because while they do have their own skill sets, most of them merely emphasize things that exist in the main Nero, rather than being different versions of the character. It doesn't feel worth the time and effort to get into it all. There is, of course, one major exception to that rule. But as I've said, Draco is going to get an entire video all to herself, effectively the second half of this video. Nero's noble phantasm is Estus Domus Aurea, or the Passionate Golden House, something like that. In it, Nero recreates the Domus Aurea, putting her enemy on a battlefield where she dominates, then strikes them down with an attack. Nero is unique in a sense that, though she has many different versions, all of her MPs ultimately boil down to using this one, and then launching a named attack, whether that be her saber version's Laus St. Claudius, her bride's version Fax Calestis, or her summer version's Laudatum Domus Illustris. These attacks by themselves aren't anything special, but when done in the Golden House, combined with Nero's imperial privilege allowing her to make things how she wants, these attacks become noble phantasms. As for the lore, the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House, was a massive construction project undertaken by Nero in the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. It was meant to be an enormous palace complete with temples, pavilions, vineyards, an artificial lake, and much more. An extremely opulent project made of gold, marble, jewels, ivory, and, of course, a gigantic bronze statue of Nero himself, estimated to be at least 30 meters tall, or almost 100 feet. The Domus Aurea was not finished by the time Nero died in 68 CE, and his successors were rather embarrassed by its sheer decadence. Over the following decades, its grounds were gradually built over by other monuments, notably the Baths of Trajan and, most famously, the Colosseum. Despite that, some remnants of the Domus Aurea survived, and were later rediscovered at the end of the 15th century. Work to preserve what remains of the Domus Aurea continues to this day, though it is now open to visitors. As far as choosing an MP for Nero goes, the Domus Aurea is probably the best choice, certainly for a more positive portrayal of the guy, to showcase his interest for art, opulence, and ambitious construction projects. The MP animation does make it seem like the Domus Aurea is one gigantic theater rather than a complex of many different buildings, but the spirit of the MP, that of an absurdly luxurious palace that Nero built, that works quite well. Nero's craft essence is Thunderous Applause, depicting the Domus Aurea, the Fate version of it. The CE's text is relatively short, with it talking about how Nero celebrates the life of the people, both the good and bad. Honestly, there really isn't much for me to say about this Bonsi aside from what I already said about her MP. So let's talk about something vaguely connected to the CE's name instead. Nero's tendency to put himself on stage and perform. Whether it was through acting, music, poetry, or the aforementioned participation in the 67 CE Olympics, Nero seemed to love being the center of attention, to receive the adoration of the people. But this proved to be a double-edged sword, since while Nero's behavior was very popular with the common people in Rome, it was very much looked down upon by the upper classes, because performers were seen as among the lowest in Roman society, and so beneath the dignity of Nero's office. It certainly didn't help that all of Nero's pet projects, particularly the Domus Aurea featured in this craft essence, cost an obscene amount of money. And guess who had to pay for all that? This actually plays a role in Nero's negative portrayal by Roman historians, since those historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, tended to be from the upper senatorial classes, the people most hostile to Nero, and so not inclined to say nice things about him in the history books. Nero's Valentines CE is the Emperor, featuring a cake decorated with a laurel leaf and roses atop it. Fancy. When was the last time I had a fancy cake? Those tend to be saved for birthdays, so once a year or so? Anyway, one of Nero's in-game titles is the Emperor of Roses, and roses certainly play a prominent role in Nero's fate depiction. But where does this come from? Well, it goes back to the Domus Aurea, the gigantic palace complex that Nero started to build after the Great Fire of Rome, but never actually finished. One of the rooms there, the octagonal room, the room that Nero's MP is probably based upon, was a large chamber that could serve multiple purposes, but was mainly used as a dining hall. The octagonal room had two special features: a rotating ceiling that depicted the stars in the sky, and also to spray perfume and rose petals upon the guests. That room survives to this day, actually, though it has lost its original opulence. This is why, I think, Nero gets the additional title of the Emperor of Roses in the Fate franchise. As for Nero Bride CEs, Ring of Bay Laurel for her Bond CE, or May Breeze for her Valentines, I didn't bother digging into them because both of them just continue the wedding theme, a wedding ring and a bouquet respectively. They're kinda self-explanatory. And now for characterization, starting with a look into the legends surrounding Nero. The legends surrounding Nero, huh? More like infamy. For those of you here who were first introduced to Nero from the Fate franchise, or don't know anything about the historical Nero aside from what I've said so far during this video, buckle up, because you're in for a ride. Nero is one of the most notorious Roman emperors, widely held up as one of the worst in all of Rome's history, which, considering who the competition is, Caligula, Commodus, Elagabalus, Honorius, Valentinian III, trying to pick who the worst Roman emperor is out of this bunch is like fighting in a cesspool, choosing between some of the most incompetent, vile, and corrupt leaders in human history, all serving as examples as to why authoritarianism and inherited leadership are a bad idea. Now, I actually don't think Nero is the worst emperor in Rome's history. To me, that award goes to Honorius. But Nero was still pretty bad. Or was he? Because as I've mentioned numerous times throughout this video, Nero is very much a victim of historical slander, of having his reputation blackened by those who hated him for one reason or another. He wasn't a good emperor, far from it, but he certainly wasn't the worst either. I've mentioned how many people, first the upper-class Roman historians, then the later Christians, were biased against Nero. But what's the real story? For this backstory section, I'm going to stick to either what we can confirm, or what is most likely to be true, which means some of the craziest things written about Nero are going to be left out. At the end of the day, we are dealing with the story of someone who was born almost 2,000 years ago. We can only work with what information we have, questionable though it may be. The man that would later be known as Nero was born on the 15th of December, 37 CE, in the city of Antium, what is today Anzio, Italy. Yes, the same Anzio that was the site of a messy amphibious landing during the Second World War. There's still a statue of Nero in Anzio, actually. For the sake of consistency, I'm going to keep using the name Nero even before he actually got that name. His birth name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the son of the politician Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus and his wife Julia Agrippina, also known as Agrippina the Younger, to distinguish her from her mother, Agrippina the Elder. Since Nero's mother was the younger sister to the emperor Caligula, you would think that this meant that Nero would have an easy and pleasant childhood. Short version, it wasn't. In 39 CE, Agrippina and a few others were implicated in an assassination attempt on Caligula, leading to exile and their wealth being confiscated. I should also say that both of Nero's parents, Domitius and Agrippina, did not have good reputations, at all. Domitius was a scamming, womanizing jackass, who only escaped execution by the Emperor Tiberius because Tiberius died before he could carry it out. And Agrippina? Well, let's just say that the plot to kill Caligula would be far from the last time Agrippina got herself involved in a murder plot. One anecdote states that, upon the birth of their son, Domitius said that a child of himself and Agrippina would be truly wicked, a danger to the public. Domitius would die in January 41 CE, when Nero was 3. Nero's father left him an inheritance, but the Emperor Caligula seized it for himself. But only a few weeks later, Caligula would be assassinated by his own bodyguards, the first Roman emperor to be assassinated, and certainly not the last. The new emperor was Caligula and Agrippina's paternal uncle, Claudius, who ended Agrippina and Nero's exile. Agrippina would get married to someone else, who would then die of suspicious circumstances in 47 CE, probably poisoned by Agrippina so that she could claim his vast wealth. But after Emperor Claudius's own wife was executed for adultery in her part in a planned coup a year later in 48 CE, both Claudius and Agrippina found themselves single, and they decided to get married in 49 CE. This was pretty scandalous though, since, again, Claudius is Agrippina's uncle. Hooray, incest. Agrippina's son was then adopted by Claudius a year later, given the new name of Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. Drusus would be replaced by Augustus when Nero himself later became emperor. But the marriage between Claudius and Agrippina would not have a happy ending. You see, Claudius had a son named Britannicus from his previous marriage, but Agrippina wanted her son, Nero, to be Claudius's successor, so that she could then rule through him. In order to make that happen, Agrippina took a few steps to ensure that Nero, not Britannicus, would succeed Claudius. First, she arranged a marriage between Nero and Claudius's daughter, Claudia Octavia. Naturally, Agrippina got Octavia's fiancé accused of incest, which seems kinda rich considering Agrippina married her uncle Claudius, but it led to Octavia's fiancé offing himself in disgrace, clearing the way for Nero to marry Octavia. In other words, in 53 CE, when he was 16, Nero married his stepsister. I mean, they did get her adopted into another family first to fix that, but they were still related since Claudius was Octavia's father, and Claudius was also Nero's great-uncle. Hooray, more incest! Anyway, now that Nero was married to the daughter of the emperor, but that it would only be a few more years before Britannicus would come of age, and potentially be named Claudius's heir instead of Nero, a year later in 54 CE, Agrippina decided that it was time to kill her husband, again. Once again, she would use poison, though this time Agrippina would hire an expert, a woman from Gaul named Locusta. With the death of Emperor Claudius, and with Britannicus only being 12, this ensured that his adopted son Nero, age 17, would succeed him, becoming the 5th Emperor of Rome. Now, some of you might be wondering, because I'm already 1,000 words into this backstory section, is this a video about Nero or about his mother, Agrippina? Well, I made a point of going into detail about Agrippina and her various machinations because, 1, she's Nero's mother, and 2, to give a glimpse of the world that Nero grew up in. Since Nero would later become famous for his ego and narcissism, the reason he was like that could be that his mother treated him not as a son, but rather as a tool she could use. At least, that was her intention. But it turned out that, once Nero became emperor, he began to have his own ideas. Rather than having his mother as his chief advisor, Nero instead turned to his tutor Seneca, a notable philosopher and writer, who among other things wrote a play called Medea, telling the story of her revenge against Jason. The marriage to Octavia that his mother had arranged as part of her power plays, it wasn't one Nero wanted, leading him to go off and have affairs. Lastly, of course, Nero began to express other interests, such as music, the arts, and not being a good little puppet for his mother to use. As the years progressed, the relationship between Nero and his mother became increasingly tense. But for a while, those tensions were kept under the surface. With the advice of Seneca and his Praetorian prefect Burrus, the first 5 years of Nero's reign, 54 to 59 CE, were among the best the Roman Empire ever had, a time of good governance, reforms, and a lack of scandal. Well, not completely. One thing Nero and his mother did agree on was that his stepbrother Britannicus was a potential threat to his reign, leading Nero to employ Locusta, the same assassin who had helped poison Emperor Claudius, to dispose of Nero's half-brother. But Nero's good 5 years would come to an end in 59 CE, when matters between himself and his mother came to a head. Between all Agrippina's manipulations and scheming, her disapproval of Nero cheating on his assigned wife Octavia, and the fact that, if Agrippina could have one emperor murdered, then she could do it again, Nero decided to settle things with his mother, permanently. But despite the fact that Agrippina was a murderous, scheming control freak, murdering your own mother is not really acceptable. And it marked the turning point when Nero changed from being a capable emperor backed by good advisors, to instead become an increasingly unrestrained tyrant. After all, once you've broken one of the biggest taboos there is, killing your own parent, other restraints probably don't seem like that big of a deal to you anymore. From that point on, things continued to get worse. Nero's advisor Burrus would die in 62 CE, and his other advisor Seneca would find himself increasingly isolated, eventually being falsely implicated in a plot against Nero and forced to commit suicide in 65 CE. Without these stabilizing influences, Nero became increasingly megalomaniacal. He divorced and exiled his wife Octavia in 62 CE. Then, after people protested, he had her accused of adultery and executed. Nero then married his love interest Poppaea Sabina, but this marriage would also have an unhappy ending. Their daughter, Nero's only child, would die after only 5 months, and then Poppaea herself would die in 65 CE, presumably of a miscarriage, though some suggest that she was actually beaten to death by Nero. I'm more inclined to believe the former, since Nero would deeply mourn Poppaea's death, and 2 years later he would castrate and marry that slave boy Sporus who apparently resembled her. In the midst of this was also that marriage to Pythagoras where Nero played as the bride, which reportedly happened in 64 CE, when Poppaea was still alive. Also in 64 CE was the Great Fire of Rome and the subsequent persecution of Christians, which I've already talked about. Other notable events of Nero's reign include Boudicca's revolt, which I covered in my video on Boudica, a war against Parthia from 58 to 63 CE, ending in a peace treaty that lasted over half a century, and lastly the outbreak of the Great Jewish Revolt in 66 CE, the first of several Roman-Jewish wars that ultimately led to the destruction of the Jewish temple, and eventually the expulsion of the Jews from their homeland in Judea by the Emperor Hadrian, an event which clearly has had absolutely zero long-term consequences. Since Nero's reign took place during the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire at the height of its power, most of his concerns were domestic, but it would be those domestic concerns that would ultimately be Nero's undoing. Because now that Nero was liberated from the influence of his mother and his advisors, he spent most of his energy on what he wanted to do. And what Nero wanted to do was be the center of attention, to be on stage, perform, and to build extravagant monuments dedicated to himself. But all of Nero's self-aggrandizement, that cost money, a lot of money. So too did rebuilding Rome after the Great Fire. How would Nero pay for all this? Well, Nero does have the dubious honor of being the first emperor to devalue the Roman currency, starting a trend that would lead to disaster just over a century later. That gave Nero a little bit of money, but he needed much more than that. Now, despite his tendency to lesser himself by being an entertainer for the common people, Nero's relationship with the Senate and upper classes actually started out pretty good, especially compared to his predecessors and their love for stealing property, treason trials, and executions. But as time went on, not only did Nero start doing those things, he committed the greatest sin of all. He raised taxes upon the wealthy. I know, it's shocking. What kind of monster would raise taxes upon people who already have tons of money, rather than squeezing every last drop out of those dirty peasants struggling to survive? Well, someone clearly was thinking along those lines, because it was in 68 CE that first Vindex, and then Galba, 2 Roman governors, rose in revolt against Nero and his taxes. From there, the dominoes continued to fall, as the Praetorian Guard and the rest of the army either defected to Galba or simply refused to obey Nero's orders, having been bribed to turn against him. For all his popularity with the common people of Rome and the eastern provinces of the empire, Nero soon found himself facing a major revolt without any allies. Fleeing Rome with only a handful of companions, including Sporus, Nero found himself in a villa, having been declared a public enemy by the Senate. After vacillating between taking his own life, wanting someone else to do it for him, or sticking things out, the sound of incoming riders forced the issue. The riders tried to keep him alive, but it was too late. Emperor Nero died on the 9th of June, 68 CE at the age of 30, either by his own hand or with the help of one of his followers. Nero's death led to mixed reactions throughout the Roman world. For the Senate and upper classes, they were glad to see him go, whereas the common people were deeply upset, to the point that future Roman emperors either honored or connected themselves to Nero in the hope of gaining the people's support. There is also the Nero Redivivus legend that I mentioned earlier, about how people believed that Nero would one day return, or of several pretenders claiming to be Nero in the decades following his death. Since people tend not to claim to be someone who is universally hated, it's clear that Nero remained popular well after his death. But since it was the rich and the senatorial classes who were literate, and so wrote the histories, it was the people who hated Nero who ended up writing about him, giving us a portrayal of a man who was a tyrant at best, and a depraved monster at worst. And Christians? They certainly never forgot that Nero was the first to persecute them, leading to a whole host of literature that I'm going to need an entire separate video to unpack. It's only really been in recent decades that people have started to reevaluate Nero, to try to give the guy a fairer assessment not tainted by the bias of the writers. But whatever your opinion of Nero might be, one thing is for certain. He is one of the most infamous of Rome's emperors, whose reputation persists even after almost 2,000 years since his birth. So how does the Fate franchise decide to portray this most infamous of Roman emperors? Well, in Nero's first appearance in the Fate franchise, the 2010 PSP game Fate Extra, we actually get a sizable section where she talks about her own backstory, giving us something that we can directly compare to the history that we just went through. To sum it up, while the story of Fate's Nero is broadly similar to the historical Nero, a few key details have been changed, such as saying that Nero's first wife and his mentor Seneca took their own lives of their own accord, when in reality, Octavia was executed, and Seneca was forced into suicide after being accused of being part of a plot against Nero. The Fate writers also created a new story which I've mentioned earlier, of how Nero's mother Agrippina was simultaneously poisoning and giving the antidote to Nero as a means of control, and that, since Nero lost the antidote after killing her mother, she became afflicted by severe headaches for the rest of her life, likely being a major contributing factor in Nero's increasingly erratic behavior afterwards. While it is certainly true that Nero's mother Agrippina was a very nasty piece of work, and that Nero's reign certainly took a turn for the worse after he murdered his mother, this story is an invention of the Fate franchise, a way of not only trying to explain why Nero became worse over time, but also to try to make her a more sympathetic character, a victim of a cruel and manipulative mother who only thought of Nero as a tool. It's different, but still consistent with the real history, unlike the changes made to the fates of Octavia and Seneca. It is made clear in Fate that Nero did not have a pleasant upbringing, growing up in a world full of intrigue and murder, being treated as a pawn by her mother, and so leading to Nero having very poor relationships with her family members. Instead, Nero went to the people, seeking their love and approval, but her methods of trying to acquire that love were misunderstood. She could make a great show of herself through performances or putting on displays, but it was all self-serving, and all her efforts to win over the people didn't matter when her governors started the uprisings that ultimately brought Nero down. Surprisingly, Nero isn't really bitter about this, having developed some self-awareness about her failings. She may still act like a haughty, self-absorbed attention-seeker with an ego big enough to rival Gilgamesh, but under the surface, Nero knows that she is flawed, and hopes that, as a servant, she can try to get things right, to have a real relationship with someone that isn't poisoned by power games and deceit. She manages to get this in Fate Extra, developing a close relationship with her master, Hakuno Kishinami. This continues into the other Extraverse games. Well, I admit I don't know how it goes in Fate Extra CCC, because that game has never been made available in North America, and seems like it never will. Apparently it's too lewd or something. Whoever thinks that should probably go take a look at some of what's being sold on Steam these days. Anyway, Fate Extella follows up from Fate Extra, with Nero hoping to rule the Moon Cell together with Hakuno, but finding herself having to face a dire new threat to the Moon Cell, one that still needs to get her own video someday. As for Fate Extella Link, honestly, Nero isn't super memorable there. She is one of your main allies, but that story is dominated by Charlemagne and his ruler counterpart, Karl de Grossa. But as for Fate Grand Order, Nero's appearances have been mixed at best, and disastrous at worst. Let's go ahead and get the big one out of the way. Nero is the central ally of the Septim Singularity, with it taking place in the year 60 CE, the year of Boudica's revolt, and a year after Nero killed her mother, Agrippina. Compared to her appearance in Fate Extra, it's like they kept all of Nero's self-absorbed arrogance, but then cut out any trace of self-awareness, leaving us with a shallow narcissist who inexplicably receives praise from everyone around her. It's like Septim was written to be the opposite of what Roman historians wrote about the real Nero, to make Fate's Nero seem so awesome and so beloved that it just gets obnoxious. All of Nero's arrogance and self-promotion is taken at face value, while her worst aspects are swept under the rug. If this was someone's first encounter with Fate's Nero, I don't blame them for being completely turned off. For the record, my introduction to Fate's Nero was in Fate Extella. Not as good as Fate Extra, but much better than Septim. Nero's other FGO appearances haven't been as bad, but they've also been relatively minor. Of her 3 interludes, 2 involve a treasure hunt hoping to raise money to improve her Domus Aurea, while the 3rd reminds Nero of her death, telling the Fate original story of how her body was found by a soldier, covered up, only for Nero's eyes to open and utter her last words. The Nero Fest events do showcase her love of spectacle and staging grand events, which is true to the original, but is otherwise very thin on story content. Nero has many more appearances than the ones I've mentioned, but since this video is turning out to be even longer than the one on Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, I better start wrapping this up. So, to summarize, Fate Nero's characterization is that of a self-important emperor who loves being the center of attention, and has basically come to represent the Roman Empire in the Fate franchise. Since Caesar is a bad joke, Romulus is a meme, and Caligula is different. But while Nero in Fate Extra was actually portrayed pretty decently, her appearances since then have continued to get worse and worse, ultimately leading to a character in Fate Grand Order that is divisive, to say the least. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Nero's depiction in Fate Grand Order in the wider Fate franchise? Well, let's see. Class? Fail. Gender flip? Fail, but I'm a bit more forgiving. Design? Fail, though the lion is a nice touch. And the entire concept of Nero Bride is a clever way of showing at least someone dug into Nero's story. Skill set? It's mixed. A few connections there, but a few inventions too. MP? Good enough. Craft essences? For one of the oldest servants in FGO, they work just fine. But, as always, the decisive factor is characterization, where, again, Nero's portrayal is mixed. On the one hand, her personality is pretty good, being a massive attention seeker who likes to put on a spectacle, but then giving us a backstory that reveals why Nero is like this. A vicious, cutthroat world where she was treated as a mere tool, even by those who should have been her closest allies. And so she went to the people to find the affection she sought, though that too ultimately had an unhappy ending. It's probably the most sympathetic portrayal of Nero ever made, and while some of that was accomplished by changing some facts and omitting others, the core of the character still connects to the historical Nero. And yet, while other Fate characters have improved over time, Nero has gotten worse, not better. When a character has a bad start, but then gets better over time, I tend to be nicer to them. But here we have the opposite, a character whose best appearance was her very first one, and it's been all downhill from there. Perhaps that's why they decided to remake Fate Extra, to let newcomers see Nero at her best, to try to make them forget about Septum. It's supposed to come out this year, apparently. But to wrap all this up, Nero's portrayal in the Fate franchise is flawed, with a decent start and some good links to the original, but between all the changes made to her backstory, the additions that the Fate writers made, and a portrayal that has gotten worse over time, what we have now is not good. And so for a final grade, I'm going to give Nero Claudius, the 5th Emperor of Rome, a D-. I spent the better part of a day debating whether or not to fail Nero, but in the end, there's enough good bits that Nero gets saved from the flame. Barely. Another slip-up, and she's gonna light up like one of her torches. Anyway, if you would like to learn more about the character that Nero weirdly resembles physically, but is her polar opposite in personality, check out my video on King Arthur right here. Also please like, subscribe, and come check out the streams during the weekend sometime, currently taking place in the endearingly glitchy world of Oblivion Remastered. Until next time.